text is doing functionally.
Loads the style CSS file from the server, but I'm not exactly sure if it always does it asynchronously or not.
OK, good. So it loads the file, styles.css, from the server, which turns out is just a text file. And in that text file is, as you might have guessed, CSS, or cascading style sheet rules. It does load it synchronously, top to bottom. So there is, in fact, an order to the tags in HTML, so that if you load a file here and then another one here, you can, in fact, assume that B is going to be loaded after A, which certainly has its advantages, though we'll see some problems that can nonetheless arise when it comes to this sort of worry about synchronization. This relation here is just telling the browser that the relation of this file to the rest of the HTML here is that it's meant to be a style sheet, so it should somehow be applied. And so inside of this styles.css file is your typical rules for fonts and colors and borders and all of that. And they are then applied to all of the elements, all of the tags subsequently in this web page. So that too is probably familiar, but we'll use this to our advantage as time passes, certainly to stylize things and perhaps solve some additional problems that might arise. In fact, let's go ahead and propose this. This website that we have here, it's pretty damn uninteresting. All we have is a super simple text-based website for the course. Not all that compelling, even though if we click through these various links on the course's website, we would actually get to the PDFs and the content that we want. But let's see if we can't stylize this a bit more so that we can make a web application look more like it's a native application, even though I have no idea yet how to write a single line of Objective-C. So let's try to make this look more like an actual application. So to do this, let me offer a brief aside on the ways in which you can approach development of web-based applications on your own Mac, presumably, but the same holds true for PCs. Whenever you start writing in JavaScript code, if unfamiliar, you often trip over a security feature of browsers, whereby if you try to run a JavaScript file locally that's living on your own hard drive, it's not going to run because the browser's trying to protect you against something that could very well be malicious. So you can work around this by changing Chrome settings or changing Safari's or your various browser settings. Or we can solve this problem by just introducing an actual web server. Now, it would be a pain if we all had to go out and buy a commercial web host and maybe a domain name and actually put all of our files for the course and for this first project on some remote server. But we can actually replicate that idea even without having internet access ultimately by just running a web server on our own computer. So what I'm going to propose that you do for this first project, which we'll talk about later, but what I've done here in advance is I've downloaded some free software called XAMPP. XAMPP. And this is free software that actually exists for Mac OS, Linux, Windows, and probably a couple of other operating systems that once you figure out how to navigate its somewhat cryptic pages of links, you can get down to the download page and download, in this case, the universal binary for Mac OS. And as an aside, for any projects, we would point you in this direction explicitly. You don't have to memorize all of these little details. But long story short, once I download this program, run it on my local computer, it will install free software called Apache. Apache is a very popular web server software that's used all throughout the world, and you can run it on your little old laptop in addition to PHP and MySQL, which also comes with XAMPP. But what's nice about this is that it gets you up and running super fast, even without having to tinker with your Mac's own built-in settings. So I did this in advance, and I ran the installer, and what that gives me is a program called the XAMPP control panel. So I'm going to go ahead and load this file here, and I'm going to get a very simple two screens. One is just a reminder of how to get started with this thing, and the other is just this little control panel via which I can start Apache. And we're not going to bother using FTP or MySQL. All we need is a place to put our files. I'm being prompted for my password there, and I should now see a green light, which indicates that a web server is running on my computer. Unfortunately, my computer here is not on the public internet. I don't even know what its IP address is, and it definitely doesn't have a domain name. So how do I go about accessing with a browser, let's forget about phones for the moment, the web server that's now running on my particular laptop here? Yeah. Yeah, so it turns out that all computers that are running web servers are configured with a default name, and that name is usually localhost. So if I pull up a browser, I happen to be using Chrome, but I could use Safari or whatever else I have on my own Mac here, and I do http://localhost, one word, and then hit enter, what I'll see is this default page. So this is coming from a web server. It just so happens that that web server is running where? Okay, on my own laptop. Has nothing to do with the internet. I could unplug my cable now. I could turn off the Wi-Fi, and I could still actually interface with this development environment. And so that's what we're going to use it for. You don't strictly have to do this for the first project, but this is a nice and quick and dirty way of getting yourself up and running with a web server. So now we can get back to focusing on the web stuff and the development thereof. So what I'm actually going to do next is I'm going to grab the distribution code for tonight's lecture. So if I go to cs76.net, if you have trouble getting on Wi-Fi during the break, we can log in as ourselves if need be, or you can use your Harvard University ID and PIN. But we'll take a break in a little while and can field those kinds of questions. If we go to the course's website and go to lectures, I myself am going to scroll down to source code. I'm going to download a zip of that source code. Once I unzip it, it's going to end up on my desktop, and it's going to be a directory called source 0. And in there is all of tonight's examples in advance in case we want to pull up something that's been pre-written. And what I'm going to do now, for those less familiar, let's see. Actually, I'm going to do this the easy way. I'm going to open up my Finder. I'm going to go ahead and find my own personal jharvard directory. And I'm going to create in this directory a folder called Sites. Now, I had no idea that I was supposed to create a folder called Sites until I read this little cheat sheet that popped up automatically when XAMPP was installed. Now, tragically, there's a typo in the little cheat sheet here, and it says create a folder called Sites-folder. There should be no dash. There should be no folder. It's just a folder called Sites. But now that I've done this, anything I put in there is going to be accessible on that web server running locally as though I had put it there via FTP or SFTP. All I'm going to do is start putting my files in there. So for simplicity, what I'm going to do is drag my source 0 directory into my sites directory so that for the rest of tonight, everything is in that folder. And now I argue that it's accessible via my browser. So let me prove that. Let me go back to my browser. Let me go to http://localhost. Unfortunately, I still see this default screen, and XAMPP has taken it upon itself to redirect me even more deeply into the server. But I'm going to say no. I want to go to ~jharvard and then hit Enter. And now I see the contents of John Harvard's Sites folder. And so what's in there now is my source 0 directory. And now we can resume our look at this really poorly implemented website for the course now that we have a web server running locally, now that I've copied the distribution code for tonight into that public directory, and now that I've pulled up the appropriate URL in my browser connecting to that local web server. All right. That was perhaps a lot that was new. Again, the project specification will recap any details you need to repeat yourself. But any questions, conceptually or technologically, as to what we just did? Yeah. Sure. They do. So is this installing or just activating it or enabling it? This, I believe, comes with its own installation of Apache. So the little white lie I'm telling here is that macOS actually comes with its own instance of Apache. The upside of using XAMPP is that it works the same across various versions, Lion, Mountain Lion, of macOS. So there's many fewer technical difficulties that we've run into than having everyone turn on Apache, which is not turned on by default by Apple. And this way, too, when you upgrade macOS, XAMPP should not break on you because everything's isolated to one folder. Yes?
So I don't know why I think my Apache is on.
OK.
Somehow I got a site folder inside my folder thing.
OK.
I can't open another site folder, so now it's not working. What should I do?
OK. You have a sites folder called SITES.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's inside of that? Oh, I wonder if that ended up in, I have another account on this laptop, and maybe that guy got that. OK, so I think it's safe for you to delete the images folder, delete the index.html folder, and then you will be in the state that I'm in by dragging the source directory into that folder.
So I'll just keep that sites folder.
Keep the sites folder, empty it, though, and just put source 0 in there. That just sounds like it's sample code that comes with XAMPP when you install it in the default account, which I did not do. Then you have something else that's doing that. Let me propose that we will focus on that one-on-one at the break. How about? All right. Excellent. See, corner case. So second white lie I've told tonight is that this does not simplify things. All right. Other questions? Other questions? All right. OK, so let me do this. In our source 0, whether or not you're using XAMPP or just following along visually or using whatever other web server you prefer to run on your own laptop, I'm going to go into my CS76 directory, and I'm going to go to the HTML directory, where here I see, albeit in a desktop browser, the exact same poorly designed website that we saw a moment ago in that screenshot of an iPhone. And indeed, if I right-click on here and choose View Page Source, or Control-click on your white background,